You are listening to Regenerative Artivism, Asian Women's Creative Strategies for Social and Ecological Futures. I'm your host, Meqing Wang, an art historian working in contemporary Asian art and the environmental humanities. In each episode, we explore how Asian women artists, curators, and community organizers use creative, place-based practice to confront social and environmental injustice and cultivate more livable futures. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin. Today, we travel inland and uphill in China. We start in the Loess hills of northern Shaanxi province and then climb all the way to the headwaters of the Yangtze River on the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau to follow one artist who quietly chose to walk away from the Beijing art market and into small rural classrooms. This episode is about Wang Fangfang, a painter who has become one of the most compelling eco-pedagogues in contemporary China. Let me start with a picture. It is the late 2000s in Songzhuang artist village on the eastern outskirts of Beijing. A young painter from Shaanxi does what so many art students dream of doing. She leaves her rural home, finds a studio, and joins the rhythms of the capital's contemporary art scene, painting all day, going to openings in the famous 798 art zone, waiting for curators and dealers to visit. The painter is Wang Fangfang, born in 1981 in the rural county of Yang'an, the Loess Plateau city, more famous for revolutionary history than for contemporary art. She grew up between farm work and drawing in a landscape of terraced fields, cave dwellings, and dusty courtyards. Before she ever held a proper pencil, she was already drawing animals on the packed dirt with tricks and with the black carbon cores she cracked out of discarded batteries. In her village, where people often did not know if there would be enough to eat, women embroidered pillowcases during breaks in the fields and cut red paper into auspicious motifs. She learned to cut small patterns from their leftover scraps. That mixture of poverty, women's handwork, and improvised color was her first art school. In middle school, she chose art as her path, later studying painting at Xi'an Polytechnic University, where she absorbed a traditional, disciplined canon of academic oil painting. By the time she reached Songzhuang in 2006, she was doing exactly what her training had prepared her to do, producing technically skilled paintings for an urban art world whose center of gravity was very far from the fields and dwellings of her childhood. But there were two fractures. The first came when she took a small solo show of those Songzhuang paintings back to a folk art museum in her home county. Local viewers, especially children, looked at them politely and then looked away. They did not see their lives inside these images. They did not recognize their own courtyards, animals, or weather. What one sensed was a quiet estrangement. The second fracture was brutal and personal. In 2010, an artist friend in Beijing died by suicide. One read this not as an isolated tragedy, but as a symptom of the psychic costs of a success-obsessed, precarious art system. It forced her to ask herself, who is my work really for? What is it doing for the people I care about? Out of that double shock came a decision that from the perspective of a conventional art career, looks almost like self-sabotage. Instead of doubling down on the capital's art circuits, she turned away from them. She chose to go back to the upland villages and townships of northern Shaanxi and to devote her artistic labor to children who had never set foot in a museum. And crucially, she did not frame this as charity or as a temporary community project. She slowly redefined who she was, less studio painter, more art teacher, ecological advocate, and field-based illustrator. She later called the core of this shift natural art education, which we will unpack in a moment, but you can already feel the basic move. taking the land itself and children's lived experience of that land as the primary teacher. Wang's first long-term teaching position was in a small mountainous elementary school near her home region in Yan'an. From around 2010 until 2019, she taught art there, initially as a volunteer and then as a semi-regular presence. Most of her students came from farming or herding families. None of them had ever been to an art museum, but they knew how to tell different crops by smell. They knew the feeling of a weather change in their bones. They knew the temperament of cows, the color of Loess after rain, and the shape of the hills that ringed their villages. Wang treated the rural knowledge as the curriculum starting point. Her idea of natural art education is deceptively simple. You work from where children actually see and feel in their surroundings, and you braid that together with imagination. You do not start from standardized textbook images. You do not ask children to copy cartoon figures, model compositions, or somebody else's ideas of a proper tree. In one lesson, she asked her students to draw a tree. Like children anywhere, most of them drew the same generic symbol, brown trunk, lollipop-shaped green crown, a kind of default apple tree. Instead of correcting them on the blackboard, she walked the whole class outside. She had each child choose an actual tree, an apricot, a poplar, a jujube. They stood in front of that particular tree and really looked at the bark, the branching, the leaves, how it met the soil. Then they drew the specific tree. After drawing, they wrote a short text about it, where it stood, what it might have witnessed, how it changed across the seasons. In another lesson, she drew a standard cow on the blackboard and had the students copy it. As you might guess, their drawings all looked similar. Then she erased her cow and asked them to draw the cow in their own mind. She prompted them with questions. Is your cow male or female? Does it have horns? Is it standing, lying down, or running? Is it in a shed, in a courtyard, or on hillsides? Is it alone or with the calf? Suddenly, the room filled with very different cows, some tied in courtyards, some grazing on slopes, some sleeping. In both exercises, the goal was not a realistic rendering for its own sake. The goal was to unlock a relationship between observation and imagination. In practice, she refuses the idea that children are empty vessels, and instead starts from their lived situations and co-creates knowledge with them. But one does not use that theoretical language in the classroom. Her tools were very concrete. River storms become painting surfaces. Leaves are collected and assembled into temporary collages. Grains, husks, and twigs the children bring from home become both drawing subjects and art materials. Drawing is often paired with diary entries or short essays. Visual and verbal imagination grow together. At the same time, she paid attention to the rhythms of children's lives. Many had chores and herding responsibilities before and after school. Instead of pretending those did not exist, she folded them into her assignments. A child who had to herd sheep might be asked to observe one particular animal over a week and bring sketches and stories about the animal back to class. She also describes how care began to move both ways. One drought year, when crops were failing, a girl arrived at her dormitory door with a small bundle of withered twigs wrapped in an old plastic bag, a gift from her mother who had nothing else to spare. One writes that she was so moved she could not barely say thank you. Moments like that convinced her she could not treat teaching as a brief intervention. She owed these children a longer commitment. This is where her term grassroots art education comes in. She was not parachuting in as a superstar artist to deliver culture. She was filling a very ordinary but very deep gap in China's basic education system. Schools in central and northwestern hinterland regions that simply do not have qualified art teachers or that assign art on top of overworked general subject teachers. In that gap, natural art education starts to look like a small but very real form of environmental justice. It tells little children that their knowledge of land, animals, and weather is not backward or inferior. It is precious and worth drawing, thinking about, and caring for. Over time, she realized that telling those stories publicly could pull more people into that work. By posting travel notes and drawings from her home visits on a personal blog, she helped connect more than 100 poor students with one-to-one sponsors, quietly turning her art education trips into a corridor of resources between cities and mountain villages. As one's work in Yan'an became better known, local schools and NGOs began inviting her to share her approach more widely. Around 2015, with support from a Hong Kong-based charity, she helped establish a 5-year training program for volunteers and teachers in mountainous areas of Chongqing. The idea was not to scale up through a big national curriculum, but to equip small groups of people who could adapt natural art education to their own rural settings. The landscape in these parts of Chongqing is very different from the Loess Plateau. Deep river valleys, citrus orchards, misty ridgelines. Children's life experiences differ too. In some villages, many parents have migrated to coastal factories. Grandparents raise grandchildren. Wang asked volunteers not only to pay attention to mountains, rivers, and crops, but also to what she called the emotional ecology of the classroom. What does separation feel like for a child who sees a parent once a year? How does that shape their sense of safety, their willingness to imagine a future? In this context, drawing a cow or a hillside is not just an exercise in technique. It can be a way of holding together memories of home and feelings of absence. The training program combined short workshops with supervised teaching practice. Volunteers learned her basic principles and then experimented with them in their own settings. Start from what children already know, integrate text and image, respect local seasons and labor. The result was not a single unified method, but a distributed network of small, improvised classrooms across this mountainous area, each reconnecting art, environment, and emotion in its own way. Regeneration here appears as many small classrooms, many small exercises that quietly rebuild children's confidence in their own experience and in their relationship to land. If northern Shaanxi gave one a grounded sense of rural childhood, the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau widened her ecological horizon dramatically. In 2014, she joined an expedition organized by the environmental NGO Green River to survey wildlife and plants along the upper reaches of the Yangtze River in the Sanjiangyuan region, the source of the 3 great rivers where the Yangtze River, Yellow River, and the Mekong River all rise. What began as a short-term volunteer stint turned into a long-term commitment. In the following years, she often spent more than half the year working with Green River as a teacher, illustrator, and field worker in Tibetan communities around Loess village in Qinghai province. Here, her students were herders' children on grasslands, rather than farmers' kids on the Loess Plateau. Weekends and holidays meant helping to herd yaks and sheep, collecting dung for fuel, playing by streams. Tibetan Buddhism shaped everyday life. Wildlife such as Tibetan antelope, wild yaks, and foxes were not abstract rare species. They were neighbors. Again, one did not arrive with a fixed curriculum. She listened first. Then she designed sessions that folded environmental education into natural art education. She writes vividly about those first summers in highlands,
teaching in makeshift classrooms, where many children had never held real brushes before.
When she painted a bright blue Himalayan poppy in a sketchbook, the children gasped in unison, crowding around as if she had revealed some enormous secret. Younger siblings clung to her legs and back, while she demonstrated how to paint the tiny alpine flowers they had just picked from the glass. In some classes, children drew local animals from memory, and then compared their drawings with field photographs and scientific illustrations. The comparison was not about shaming errors. It was about sharpening their attention, learning to distinguish, for example, a Tibetan gazelle from a white-lipped deer, and link that to habitat and behavior. In other sessions, she took students outside to map their own movements between school, pasture, monastery, and home. They marked routes where they had seen certain animals, plants, or signs of environmental change. Mapping became a way of narrating a shared multi-species landscape. All of this fed into her field sketchbooks, thick with drawings of snow leopards, wild yaks, musk deers, foxes, and plants, annotated with notes from herders and scientists. Over time, those sketchbooks became something more public, ecological atlases, and eventually a full-picture book for children. In 2021, she published an illustrated book, Sanjiangyuan Wild Animals Picture Book, which tells stories of representative plateau species while situating them in the Sanjiangyuan environment. The book is designed for both urban readers and local children, and it is used at schools and small green stations along the Qinghai Tibet route to help travelers and residents identify animals and reflect on how to behave in a fragile ecosystem. In other words, the classroom extends into a book, and the book extends into roadside education hubs. The art object and the educational tool are the same thing. Her collaborations with conservation projects have also taken the form of large-scale public images. At the bird observation station by Plateau Lake, she spent weeks painting a wall-sized mural of more than 40 local bird species under extreme cold weather, learning to identify them with the help of an ornithologist and a remote camera aimed at the nesting islands.
Later, when the station received a batch of new surveillance cameras to monitor bar-headed geese, she hand-painted each camera housing in camouflage patterns based on local birds and rocks, so the equipment would sit more gently on the nesting grounds. In the thin, sub-zero air, the real challenge was keeping the paint from freezing and flaking off metal. She ended up warming her hands and the paint on the damp-filled stove between strokes. In her view, these are also forms of ecological pedagogy, making scientific infrastructure less alien in a bird's world and more legible to human visitors.
Wang also turned her attention to the Qinghai Tibet Highway itself, a huge piece of infrastructure that slices through the plateau, carrying pilgrims, tourists, truck drivers, and soldiers. She watched how speeding trucks interfered with antelope crossings, how trash piled up at the scenic stops, how travelers' gaze skimmed the surface of the landscape. Her response was to make map-based works and posters designed to slow down attention, to insert knowledge about wildlife and rivers into places where people pause, and to invite a more humble way of traveling through that environment. If you think back to the concept of regenerative athletics I laid out in the introduction, art as an active agent in repairing damaged relationships between people and place, this is a textbook example. The goal is not just awareness, but a shift in behavior and in felt relationship to the land. So far, I have described what Wang does for children and communities, but her practice is also inseparable from what it takes to sustain her own life in these places. She has written about the material conditions of working in rural schools, damp dorm rooms under 20 square meters, rough washing facilities, cooking on a makeshift stove balanced on a desk near the door of her dorm to vent the smoke, rats rustling in storerooms full of cabbages and potatoes at night. Daily routines involve hauling water, washing clothes by hand, covering bed and drawings with cloth before frying vegetables so grease does not fall on them. These are not romantic details, but reminders that teaching in such contexts is bodily, domestic, and ongoing. She also writes about colleagues and neighbors, a music teacher who braids her hair and shares supplies, visits to students' homes deep in the mountains, sometimes in cave dwellings carved into Loess, where she shares simple meals of potatoes and mandarins and watches lambs take their first shaky steps. It brings into view forms of labor that are usually invisible in both art discourse and development discourse. Cooking, cleaning, emotional support, accompaniment, care. Without naming it as such, one dignifies this reproductive labor. She shows that the work of ecological and educational regeneration depends on the whole ecology of care that includes teacher dorms, shared kitchens, and long, tiring walks to check on students. On the plateau, another layer enters, the spiritual. Like many people who travel to high altitude for the first time, she struggled with dizziness, headaches, strange dreams. But she interprets some of these altered states through Tibetan Buddhist imagery, visions of green terra, encounters with crows that she later reads as protectors, mountains that feel almost sentient. These experiences filter into her paintings. You begin to see female figures, sometimes clearly goddess, sometimes human, holding glaciers or rivers, or cradling snow leopards' cubs. Buddha figures sit in caves alongside white tigers. Forests and mountains seem to glow with a soft, internal light. This is not a New Age exoticism. It is a way of making visible an intuition that runs through her whole life, that human bodies, animal lives, water, and spiritual forces are deeply interdependent. Eco-feminist philosophers have argued, in different ways, that we need to move away from the fantasy of human mastery and toward a sense of shared vulnerability and mutual care. One's canvases could be seen as a visual theology of that interdependence, but built out her own very specific experiences in plateau classrooms, herders' homes, and NGO field stations. The continuity across all of these spaces is her insistence that attention and care are themselves ecological acts. How we see trees and cows and snow leopards matters, but how we see ourselves also matters, because a person who is completely numb or consumed by self-hatred is less able to sustain the slow work of stewardship. Why spend the whole episode on one artist teacher working mostly in places that many listeners will never visit? First, one starts from where children are. In many environmental education programs, especially in cities, we start with distant icons. Polar bears, Amazon rainforests, melting icebergs. She does the reverse. She asks children to draw the tree outside their classroom, the cow in their courtyard, the yak on their pasture, the antelope on their migration route. It affirms that their own hills, river terraces, and meadows are as important as any global symbol. Second, she integrates aesthetic, ecological, and ethical learning. In her classroom, drawing is never only about the technique. Observing a tree leads to questions about the water and seasonality. Drawing a cow leads to questions about labor and gender. Who in the family tends which animals? Drawing a snow leopard requires learning something about its prey, habitat, and threats. It is a micro-eco-humanities lab where art, science, and ethics intersect. Third, she pays attention to the infrastructures of care that make any of these possible. Teacher dormitories, the logistics of getting art materials to remote schools, the bodies that cook and clean, the long walks to visit the students' families, all of this is part of her practice. It resonates strongly with feminist critiques that remind us how often social reproduction is erased from our stories about the change. She quietly insists on putting it back in. Fourth, her work operates at the multiple scales at once. On one end, there is the intimacy of a single child finally daring to draw from their own memory instead of copying a textbook image. On another, there are picture books sold in national bookstores, NGO campaigns along the Qinghai Tibet corridor, and digital posters that reach thousands of urban readers. Her practice sits at the intersection of local classrooms, national educational gaps, and global concerns about the third pole and downstream water security. Finally, she offers us a concrete picture of what I have called regenerative athletics. She's not just critiquing damage or market emptiness. She's building capacities in children, volunteers, and herself to see and feel differently and to act on that perception. Regeneration, in her case, is not a grand gesture. It is a child drawing a non-generic tree. It is a teacher taking field notes on snow leopards. It is a volunteer learning to respect rural knowledge instead of pitying it. It is a small moment in which someone finally finds language for the fog in their own chest and take the first step out of it. Her story also loops back to a very personal ethical choice. She could have stayed in the capital, painting in a studio, continuing counting solo shows. Many artists do. Instead, she chose to root her skills toward children whose drawings might never hang in a white cube, but whose ability to care for their own places will matter enormously in the coming decades. In an early profile, one of her students reportedly asked her, very simply, whether, if they walked to the far edge of the grassland someday, they might meet her again there. A child, imagining a horizon, wondering if the adult who took their word seriously will still be there. It is a small, almost invisible measure of what regenerative Artivism looks like, from the perspective of a child, not a spectacular artwork, but trusted presence who makes it possible to see cows, trees, mountains, and one's own feelings as worthy of attention. As we close, I want to leave you with a few questions. If you think about the place where you live, your own version of a Loess hill, a riverbank, a city block, what would the natural art education look like there? If you work with young people, what would it mean to start from what they actually see and feel every day, rather than from imported images and standardized templates? And what would it take to tend your own inner ecology so that you have enough attention to care and offer to others?
Thank you for listening to Regenerative Artivism, Asian women's creative strategies for social and ecological futures. If this episode brought someone or some places to mind, I invite you to continue that reflection in your own conversations and practices. You can find a short summary and a few references in the episode description in your listening app. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the places that sustain you.